If you've been watching my videos for a while, this probably might come as a slight surprise to you. But if you think about it, maybe not that much of a surprise. You see, if you remember back, I know way back in the day, last year, I think in the summer at some point, I had the 100 subscriber special, had the kind of sci-fi build based on kind of Mass Effect-y kind of, art and design. And so doing something on Mars, again, in kind of a more sci-fi / dystopian industrialist kind of style, might actually not be that crazy to you. For reference, this series has kind of been an idea in my head for a while now. I've planned on doing something like this for a bit. In fact, I think I mentioned in that subscriber special that I even thought about continuing that kind of build with the sci-fi kind of buildings there. And I ended up doing a little bit of work on my own just for fun, but never recorded it because I never kind of wanted to. I kind of wanted to keep it my own thing, but this is something I wanted to share. It's an idea, I guess what I'm trying to say is that production value has not necessarily been one of my strong suits. Speaking of which, I hope you enjoyed that intro. But for Newport, that was just something I did on my own, and then I decided, I'm going to make that a series because why not? This is a series that is definitely more the type that I've created with the fact that it's a series in mind. Because of that, there's a few planning choices that I made, with that in mind. Namely, this series will have an end, It's a dome that's not actually absurdly massive. It's pretty big for sure, and there's going to be lots of things we're going to do in here, but I doubt this series is going to be more than 20 episodes. And I like that idea because then I can have at least one completed series on this channel, because it's not going to be Newport. There's way too much in the future that I'm going to do. That series will probably still be going on when I'm in my deathbed. I will be in bed playing Minecraft in Newport, I'll still be there. That thing is never ever going away. So I wanted something to, in a sense, help take my mind off it, give me something more, a little bit more creative to do, and also something that's gonna push a bit of what I'm good at building. Going back to the Power Station episode, I mentioned that industrial architecture is not something I had ever done. It wasn't, and since then, it's kind of been a little bit of a fascination. I loved that build so much when I did it, and I think it was that moment that ultimately has kind of led to this. Realizing that I can indeed do this. If you know City Skylines at all, this whole series is probably somewhat reminiscent to you. It is very much inspired in its concept on City Walk, City Walls Mars series. Of course, I really wanted to take it a different direction. I guess I'd describe this as a love letter, but of my making, in a sense. There's going to be, a lot of similarities, but some major differences as well. And I watched that series when it came out. I absolutely loved it, and always thought that the concept was very fascinating, and what I would do different if I were doing it, and what I would keep the same in a sense. And for a while, it just stayed there. But like I said, after that Power Station episode and doing that kind of architecture, and I think sometime around this last November or December was when I started to have the beginning idea for this series, which was, just the realization that, I actually can do this. I sat there I think I can actually convincingly do this. I have the kind of skills now, so to speak, but I do want to push my boundaries a little bit. You may have noticed in my typical series, there is not a whole lot of gradients or things like that. It's not something I've ever been good at. It's definitely not part of my style, but this is a series where I want to do that more. Now, upon saying that, you might be looking at that rock wall and going, yeah, I don't see any gradient there. You'll have to wait for it a little bit. Terrain is definitely also not my strong suit. It's why I'm avoiding it as much as possible in this, because it's all a big circle. But I do want to do a little bit more with rock work and stuff throughout this series and try to push my limits of what I can do. Also with gradients and, things like that, trying to work more with, texture and stuff like that. Something that I am not usually good at, but I think this series is going to help because I'm majorly restricted in both color palette and also material, right? I'm not going to use bricks in this series at all. Probably won't use granite, maybe polished granite for like a floor, but I highly doubt they're going to appear. There's not going to be a whole lot of color. It's not probably going to be much in terms of the colored terracottas or anything, or concretes or what stuff like that. It's going to be a mostly white, gray, and dark gray, and sometimes black kind of build. We got a little bit of color here. I do end up changing these to more of a blue rather than the green, just to talk about what I'm actually doing in this series, or in this episode I should say. I originally went with the green because I liked the green. I thought it was fun. I liked how it popped, but I think the blue made more sense because partway through building it, I kind of realized that I wanted this to be kind of like a water filtration thing. I don't know anything about water filtration. It is also sci-fi and on Mars, so it can be whatever, I guess. But in this episode, which is called the infrastructure, I wanted that to, of course, the infrastructure to be the focus, working on some of the basic core, ideas behind this build, working on the basic, like some of the basic systems that would need to be in order to actually support life on this dome. Now, in order to actually make this series make at least a little bit of sense and to give myself more ideas, I wanted to think of a reason why people would be living here in the first place, because when you actually think about it, living on Mars sounds really cool, but also is kind of impractical and theoretically unreasonable, right? It'd be super, super expensive, and arguably what would be the point? Other than the fact that it is really cool and, science and stuff. But other than that, what you doing, It's just a bunch of irony rock, And so my reasoning behind it is, what if, far, far into the future, after man has even been to Mars and things like that, man wants to push further into our solar system. We want to go to Jupiter and Jupiter's moons and Saturn and send people out to the edges of the solar system. Well, theoretically, sending all these ships from Earth means more travel time. Having bases that are further away that can be kind of like stepping stones in between these kinds of trips, I think would make more sense. Not to mention that it would help reduce the time it takes to transmit messages, because as of right now, as far as I'm aware, it takes like 20 minutes or something to send a message to Mars, and of course another 20 minutes to send it back. So you could imagine if that's just Earth to Mars, our closest neighbor in terms of planets, how bad it would be to send it to astronauts as far as Jupiter, or its moons or something. Like, that would be a really long time. And so it kind of makes sense to me that maybe Mars would be kind of a relay station in that way. And because of that, you would need power. And in order to get that power, you need people. And so, you start to set up all this stuff of like, okay, well, you have to have something here. A kind of base of operations. But I imagine it's also probably more than that. It's probably like some kind of refueling place. Maybe, there's a lot of fuel that's here. And, it kind of overall has just become a stepping stone that, requires a certain amount of population in order to maintain itself. I imagine that they probably gather some kind of resource on Mars. What that is, I don't know. But for now, my main thing is that kind of this idea of like being kind of a stopping point for the rest of the universe and starting to become more of a hub and like a kind of headquarters for more of these kinds of space agencies and things, sending out their scientists and envoys and stuff to the far reaches of our solar system. Now, one thing I do want to say is in this episode, you'll see that I do build a little bit outside the dome. There's some pipes and, some rocks and things like that. And while I do want to decorate the immediate outside of the dome, and I have thought about doing some kind of bigger terrain in the distance so that you can put on Voxymod and have, more of a horizon in a sense. For the most part, I don't think I want to build anything outside this dome because I know that as soon as I allow myself to do it, I'm going to be building a ton out there, and then this series is going to last more than 30 episodes, And the whole point of the series is it's meant to be a fun, shorter kind of series, short compared to anything else. Yeah, compared to Newport, I should say. Compared to anything else. I have a series on my channel with only one video. So definitely not the shortest, although considering only one video this has been made, who knows? But I am excited already for the next episode. I have lots of ideas, like I said, with that kind of idea, that story of like that kind of a thing. And with that, you may also notice, there's a bit of trash here, right? It's kind of a dirty place. Again, calling back to City Wall's version of Mars. I don't want to go quite as dystopian, as his reality, but I do want some kind of representation of, in a sense, like that hierarchy and that classism that, would probably appear in a place like this, right? When you think about it, this is most likely entirely owned by a corporation rather than a government, right? That there wouldn't be any kind of voted in leader of Mars because everything that you see built would be built by, like I said, a corporation, a company that has a CEO. If he's voted in, it's by, or she, I should say, if they're voted in at all, it's going to be by, shareholders who want to make a profit. They don't necessarily care about all of the well-being of people here. And considering that communication to Earth would be more difficult and fighting for yourself would be more difficult since they control the food, they control the water and the air you breathe, you could imagine that people would probably start to get taken advantage of pretty quickly, which is depressing, but a reality of the human condition in a sense, right? Greed is just something that exists. And I do want to represent that here. Like, people here are trying to work, trying to get out of it, but that's not always necessarily possible. And ultimately, it would be a hard thing, right? These people would be living a long, long way from Earth, probably with very little, if any, ability to get back home if they wanted to. Imagine it would be a pretty hard existence. And I could imagine, raising kids on Mars, you probably would have a hard time getting out of the strata that you're born into. It would be expected of you to just kind of do what your parents did, replace the workforce kind of a thing. Which is incredibly depressing, but it's not something that I talk about that too much with Newport, and so it's something that I want to bring up more here, that kind of how greed in a sense affects people. But of course, with that, there are also going to be nicer areas, mostly right, above the actual ground level of Mars, because as you can see, most of this is sunken into the ground. That's the way I wanted it to be. And then the dome itself rises above the actual surface of the planet. And I imagine most of what would be up there would be a lot nicer, fancier buildings for said diplomats and scientists and things, for wealthy people who just want to visit Mars and, whatnot. It would be a much nicer place that would be quite literally living above everyone else, in a kind of very real physical representation of that kind of classism. Now, in terms of inspiration, there's also an artist that I found that I'm not going to go into right now. I'm going to talk about him a little bit more in the next episode because, like the sci-fi video, I've taken some inspiration from some art I found that I've fallen in love with and is exactly the vibe I want. In fact, it directly influenced one of the things I added in, which you'll not really see in this video, except at the very end, you'll see there's a few colorful, wool creations that are obviously not going to stay as colorful and made of wool. And one of those creations is a very long series of double lines, which will be a kind of train system, which I did think about adding in to add more movement, in a sense, to add more kind of layers, because I want layers, I want a lot of that verticality in this build. But I ended up scrapping the idea at first, and because I just couldn't quite fit it in. But upon seeing that the art that again, we'll talk about it more in next episode when it actually comes up. But I loved it so much that I very quickly realized that I just had to do that, I very quickly realized that it had to exist in this space. And yeah, but anyways, talking about what I'm actually building here, right? Some exhaust ports here for what I imagine is some kind of incineration plant, is the building with the big like A on it, which I might change that logo, but that was just what I came up with at the time. But that is what I was thinking of that would be, because it generates some kind of power and then you'd pump those gases to the surface. Would make the most sense to me, at least. With the general idea being of terraforming Mars, I guess, which I'll talk a bit more about that later, I think. So considering that, like I said, the kind of vague story or reason behind people living here, especially for this dome in particular, is because Mars in this kind of universe is a more stepping off point for people traveling beyond. And of course, you would need to transport things here. It means there would be quite a lot of goods, freight coming in and out from here and there, from of course far places coming to Mars before heading back to Earth, and vice versa, and of course things going in between Mars and Earth and other places itself. And because of that, it only made sense to have our own Amazon facility. Is it actually Amazon? I don't know. It wasn't my plan for it to be an Amazon building, but I kind of like that idea. It definitely would make it feel more dystopian if it was owned by Amazon, so maybe I'll do that. Yeah, I think I've just convinced myself. If you couldn't tell, I'm not a huge fan of Jeff Bezos. I mean, is anyone really? But that's not a new thing. And so that's kind of what this building here is. It's meant to be a kind of larger kind of sorting facility. You could imagine that inside, which might do a little bit of that, not all of it, but a little bit, that inside this kind of big block of a building is a lot of is these kinds of conveyor belts coming in and out of this building in these various directions, heading off to various places they'd have to go, such as freight stations on Mars, connecting this to maybe other domes or things like that, or other facilities on the planet that would need that freight, or delivering it here, and of course to where it would be taken up in kind of smaller ships that would go to space and then go to larger ships that would, of course, never actually come within atmosphere, because that's just what makes the most sense when it comes to space travel, is that you'd have a larger kind of vessel in space and then have smaller ships that would ferry things back and forth in an attempt to save fuel. So of course, like I said, there's a lot of goods that'd be moving in and around, and so this would be where all of that would be assorted and stored and then kind of moved around everywhere, and thus why it's in the center of the colony here. And because it's also in the center, and because I wanted to kind of show you a little bit more of what it's going to look like in the future down, here at the very bottom level, in a sense, it's kind of a little bit of a shanty town, right? There's a few market stalls and some shanty huts and little restaurants and things. This idea that, this is a more central location. It's right next to the freight warehouse. You imagine maybe some people bribe to steal a few, crates of this and that. You got refrigerators and things there, some like kind of more big appliances. This idea of like, people kind of kind of existing around this space. And of course that cut was probably a little bit jarring, because now there's an entire gray block, which I found is how I'm probably going to build a lot of the stuff on this series, is that I'm going to start with a kind of gray shape, or whatever color shape, and then add details later. Because for this building here, I was able to create this kind of panel concept and duplicate it around, and for the other builds, in a sense, build them like I would something in Newport. But for a lot of what the city is going to be, as you can see, it's going to be kind of strange, just blocks of concrete, because like I said, there's going to be a whole other city above this, in a sense, not fully enclosed, but kind of reaching over and creating this kind of verticality, right? So it's going to make it, in a sense, hard to see the top of the dome from a lot of places at the bottom, which is what I want. I want it to be kind of dark and claustrophobic down here. Despite the dome being so massive, I want you to feel very enclosed in these kinds of spaces. And so I quickly realized that having traditional buildings just wouldn't make any sense, right? Because a lot of this would have been modified over time. It would have been based off of, this is going to be a support column, in a sense, for more important buildings, and people just happen to live in it because it's big enough, stuff like that. A part of that verticality that I wanted to show off in this kind of first episode, kind of showing you, what's coming in store for the future, is adding all of these pipes and cables, not just on the building itself, but going across the street, which is, like I said, what I want. I want this verticality. I'm probably saying that too much, but I really want this idea for you to be able to sit at the bottom and look up and just see layer upon layer upon layer of all these things crossing over you, kind of clouding your view of everything that's above. But while I want it to feel kind of claustrophobic at first, it is those kinds of shanty houses that I also want to add in a little bit of character and, in a sense, homeliness, right? Because ultimately people do live here. They are going to at least vaguely care about what's going on. And speaking of care, we have here some slightly higher up low class apartments, like kind of more of what a middle class on this planet would look like. And so because of that, they get balconies, and you'll see in a moment that while I specifically don't want to add plants anywhere at the bottom level, there's going to be at least a few potted plants here, right? When we get to the upper levels, kind of more so in the next episode, and especially the third episode, you're going to see there's going to be a lot of bigger trees, palm trees, because I imagine it would be nice and warm and toasty in here, because of the sun and lack of atmosphere. I imagine it'd get pretty quite warm during the day, and they'd probably attempt to retain that heat overnight. So I kind of imagine it being a little bit humid and pretty warm, within the dome itself. But as I was saying, There's going to be more trees and parks and stuff at the very top level, of course, for the wealthy. But at the very bottom, they wouldn't bother putting any of that stuff. And probably in a lot of places it wouldn't grow anyways with the lack of sunlight. But at least up here in some of these places, I wanted to give them a little bit of hope, a little bit of sunshine in a sense to some of these people who are, trying to work out. Of course, will they ever make it? Who knows? Probably not, sadly, but I wanted there to be this idea of people trying to make the best of it, because while this might be a kind of dirty and dingy place that people high up and in power don't care about, the people who live here would, they live there. They're going to try to make the best of it. They're going to try to make things better. And I wanted to kind of show that in how I was designing it. It could have been very easy for me to show that all of these people have just completely given up hope and they just don't care. And sure, it isn't the cleanest place, it isn't the nicest, but I wanted to show, at least in some way, that the people who live here are trying to make the best of it. They are trying to survive. They are trying to, at least be able to bear living here and to try to make their life at least a little bit better. To be kind of a little bit of hope, this kind of working through that in a sense. Now, we are actually at the end of the episode. I know, it came really quick. It feels like I did so much and also so little with this city, but you can see what I was talking about, especially here in a little bit with all the very bright, colorful builds of the future that are coming in the next episode. Yeah, I'm really proud of this one. I'm really happy with it, and I hope you guys are excited to see where this is going. You can see the tire tracks on this road, by the way. Just wanted to point that out. I was really happy with that. But yeah, you can see the start of some bigger buildings. The start, I should say. Some bigger buildings and things. And here in a second, you'll see, there's those cables coming across and coming down here, and being able to look up these cables is just, chef's kiss. Amazing. It's just, that is what I want. That's what I'm telling you with that kind of verticality, where it just keeps going up and up and up. Yeah, I am going to close this one out. Again, apologies for this episode coming out late. I had to entirely re-record this voiceover, which has been fun. At least I'm doing it better the second time. Yeah, I will see you guys next episode. Bye-bye.